Taylor, I'm going to start letting people in. Okay.
Oh, sounds good. Thank you. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
All right. Welcome, everyone. I know many of you are just joining and that part. Thank you, Naomi. We are going to get started on time. So I know we have a full program and want to make sure that we have enough time at the end to get to all of your amazing questions. So first, welcome to our third workshop in our Preservation Advocacy series. Today's workshop is Seattle Landmark Designation with City of Seattle Landmarks Coordinator Erin Daugherty and my colleague Jeff Murdock, who is Historic Seattle's Preservation Advocacy Manager. I'm Taylor Roden, and I'm the Community Events Manager here at Historic Seattle. And our mission is saving meaningful places to foster lively communities. Historic Seattle knows that our properties and our programs occupy the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples. This acknowledgement is not a substitute for developing relationships with Indigenous communities or for honoring Indigenous stories as we share our collective history, but it's the first step in recognizing the people whose land we occupy. And before I turn the program over to Erin and Jeff, I have a few housekeeping items. I'll start with some thank yous. I'd like to thank our sponsors for making our education programming possible. So a big thank you to Bricklayers and Allied Craft Workers Local 1, Washington and Alaska, Daniels Real Estate, the Greystone and Gridiron, Selland Community Foundation, and Urban Villages and Railspur. And I also want to give a special shout out to Sarah Sote, who is the City of Seattle's Historic Preservation Officer. Thank you, Sarah. And of course, continuing our thank yous, all of my Historic Seattle colleagues, Naomi, special shout out to Eugenia Wu, who's our Director of Preservation Services, who just waved you all, Jeff Murdock, who I'll introduce in detail later, our Preservation Advocacy Manager, and specifically the thank yous for their efforts in curating and coordinating this series for us all. And just to kind of let you know how the flow will go today, we'll start off with Erin, and then I'll come back and introduce Jeff. And at the end, Eugenia will facilitate our Q&A. So please share your questions for Erin, Jeff, Sarah, and Eugenia in the chat. And for those of you tuning in on YouTube, I'll also monitor the YouTube chat as well and make sure that I pass your questions along to Eugenia. A reminder to everyone that this is a safe space for all participants. And we want to make sure that it's a respectful space for learning, listening, and exploration. To that end, homophobic comments, discrimination, insults, racism, sexism will not be tolerated. And with that, I'm going to go ahead behind my slides. Speakers, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first presenter, Erin Daugherty. So Erin is with the City of Seattle's Historic Preservation Program within the Department of Neighborhoods. She coordinates the Landmarks Preservation Board and the Sandpoint Naval Air Station Landmark District. Erin is a licensed architect in the state of Washington with more than 20 years of experience in historic rehabilitation and new construction in the states of New York and Washington state. So everyone, please join me with do a silent applause or real applause in welcoming Erin Daugherty, our first presenter for today. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen so that Erin, you can take it over. Oh, Erin, I think you're still on mute for us.
Unmuting myself is another step. Thank you, Taylor, for your introduction. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, super. So I'm very grateful to be here to speak with all of you today about the city's Historic Preservation Program, which is intended to preserve, enhance, and protect the longevity of neighborhoods, buildings, landscapes, and objects of historic, cultural, political, economic, architectural, engineering, or geographical significance, with long-term goals of fostering community, promoting the experience and vitality of significant places, and supporting cultural tourism and educational opportunities. My slides won't advance. There we go. Before jumping straight into the landmarks program and process, I wanted to provide just a brief overview of the city's 8 local historic districts. See some representative images here. Pioneer Square, designated in 1970, Pike Place Market Historical District in 1972, the International Special Review District of 1973, Ballard Avenue of 76, Columbia City of 1978, Harvard Belmont in 1980, Fort Lawton in 1988, and in 2012, the Sandpoint Naval Air Station Landmark District. Working with the local community, the city has established design guidelines and review boards and commissions composed of neighborhood representatives for each of these 8 districts. Pioneer Square, the International Special Review District, or sometimes called the ISRD, Pike Place Market, and Ballard Avenue each have a separate board or commission and their own local committee. Whereas Columbia City, Harvard, Belmont, Fort Lawton, and Sandpoint Naval Air Station have local committees, but fall under the larger umbrella of the Landmarks Preservation Board, where those votes occur. The boards and commissions review design changes to protect significant features of buildings, structures, objects, and sites within the districts. And in 3 of the districts, change of use is also reviewed to further protect the characteristics that make the community a unique place. There are currently more than 450 designated landmarks in Seattle, including historic buildings, structures, sites, objects, and marine vessels. And this slide gives you just a sampling of the variety of landmarks, and sometimes maybe not the first thing you would think of when you think of a Seattle landmark. They're all quite different. In 1973, the Seattle City Council adopted the Landmarks Preservation Ordinance to safeguard properties of historic significance around the city. To be designated, the resource needs to be at least 25 years old and must meet at least one of the 6 designation standards as outlined in the ordinance. In addition, the resource must also possess the integrity or ability to convey its significance. So I'm going to go through each of the standards and show just a few examples of each one. It's important to know that most every landmark has been designated for more than one standard, although the board really only needs to choose one. So standard A, it is the location of or is associated in a significant way with a historic event with a significant effect upon the community, city, state, or nation. Standard B, it is associated in a significant way with the life of a person important in the history of the city, state, or nation. Standard C, it is associated in a significant way with a significant aspect of the cultural, political, or economic heritage of the community, city, state, or nation. D, it embodies the distinctive visible characteristics of an architectural style or period or method of construction. Standard E, it is an outstanding work of a designer or builder. And finally, standard F, because of its prominence of spatial location, contrasts of siting, age, or scale, it is an easily identifiable visual feature of its neighborhood or the city and contributes to the distinctive quality or identity of such neighborhood or city. Each landmark is different, has different designated features, and sometimes it may include the site or an exterior of the building or object, or possibly select portions of the interior of a building. And with the examples shown on the screen now, the Sorrento Hotel is all 3 of those, portions of the interior, the exterior of the building, and the site. But as for comparison, Battelle Talaris campus, the interiors of the buildings are not included. It's important to know that landmark designation cannot prevent a change in use or tenancy, or attempt to keep a property unchanged forever. The certificate of approval application process is used to help manage these changes through design review rather than prevent change. The board adopts the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation, and they use these as a guide for reviewing proposed changes to a landmark to help maintain compatibility. The board also needs to assess the factors that are considered by the hearing examiner were there to be an appeal of the decision. So this is more than just compatibility and comes down to a number of additional details, and I can answer questions about that later if necessary. It is noteworthy that some landmarks in the city have been designated under all 6. And these are 5 that I've identified that meet all 6 standards. And it's interesting that Mount Zion Baptist Church is the only one that is not part of the Century 21 campus that we know today as Seattle Center. There is another one that I can think of, the Montlake Cut and Bridge. If that were to be considered today, it would probably fit within the 6 categories or the 6 standards. But in 1977, they had a different list of standards, and it's hard to have a direct comparison to how we look at them today. I also wanted to lastly note an important exception that are for properties owned by religious institutions, as we get a question about this with some regularity. In 1991, the Washington State Supreme Court ruled that imposing controls upon buildings owned by religious orders violates the First Amendment's free exercise clause. In spite of this, several religious institutions have chosen to designate their buildings in Seattle. First AME, Mount Zion, Beacon Hill Baptist, St. Joseph's, and Trinity Episcopal are among others that are on this list. But I always think it's good to be aware of the case law as it explains the city's inability to move forward with those type of landmark nominations when the property owner has not given their consent. So to talk about the landmarks process overall, our colleague Susie Phillipson on the communications team, she created a short video that's on our website. This is maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And it was a way to kind of explain the process through the basic steps that a community member or group might take if they were going to nominate a property. So I'm going to talk about it in a little more detail, but use Susie's images and talk about the 4 major parts that are part of the code. That's nomination, designation, the negotiation of a controls and incentives agreement, and the designating ordinance. So a nomination for City of Seattle landmark status may be submitted by any person or group. They may be single-family homeowners, commercial property owners, community groups, or public agencies or institutions. The nominator may be a property owner, an outside party, or someone whose proposed project is subject to SEPA referral, and that's environmental review that has different thresholds for different zones throughout the city and is part of the city's permitting process. Unlike other city permits and other application processes, there is no application fee for a landmark nomination. The Landmarks Board staff is tasked with reviewing the nomination to determine if there is enough information for the board to evaluate the historic resource, and this can be very different property to property. Jeff Murdock of Historic Seattle will talk later today about this in more detail, but it includes research and documentation to produce a narrative and images that explain the physical characteristics of the resource, as well as its history and the context of that history. The context should include not only the what, but the how and the why it came into being, including what existed before that time. We're also trying to assess if there is history that is missing or inaccurately represented. We frequently ask nominators to question their sources, and we also attempt to try and identify additional or alternate sources for them to pursue in their research. We may also ask them to reflect on their own voice and the way in which they write about history. This is a growing and evolving review process for us and anyone who has participated in the past few years. And it will continue to change so that we may tell a more complete and inclusive story of each place. Once the application review process is complete, the nomination is scheduled for consideration by the Seattle Landmarks Preservation Board at a public meeting. We accept written public comment in advance, and we take verbal public comment at the beginning when people sign up on the day of the meeting. The nominator will present the content of their application, and we will hear from the owner if they are not also the nominator. The board members have an opportunity to ask questions, and then they deliberate and vote. The board may approve the nomination in whole or in part, and once a historic resource is nominated, any alterations to the features identified in their motion require approval from the Landmarks Board to change them. If the board does not approve a nomination, the proceedings terminate and the property cannot be considered again for 5 years or 10 years for a public school building, except when requested by the property owner. Another public meeting is scheduled for designation 30 to 60 days from the date of the nomination approval. This functions very much like the nomination meeting, and the procedure is similar, but the board will then need to determine whether the site, building, or object meets one or more of the standards that we discussed previously, and if it has the ability or integrity to convey that significance. If the board does not designate the resource, again, the proceedings would terminate, and it could not be reconsidered for another 5 years, 10 years for a public school, or at the specific request of the property owner. If the board designates a property, a controls and incentives agreement for the landmark is negotiated between the board staff and the property owners. Once an agreement is reached and signed, it is forwarded to the Landmarks Preservation Board for approval at a public meeting. Controls define the features of the landmark to be preserved and outline what type of review may be needed for future changes that may be proposed for those features. Incentives may include, but are not limited to, zoning code relief, building and energy code relief are exceptions, and potential financial incentives. These can include the special tax valuation program for rehabilitation in the property, or TDR, TDP, where applicable by zone within the city. TDR is transfer of development rights, and TDP is transfer of development potential. And where those incentives are available can change over time. And any time that change happens, it's available to any landmark that can qualify regardless of when they were designated. Landmarks may also be eligible for grant opportunities. When an agreement on the controls and incentives has been completed and recommended by the Landmarks Preservation Board, a designating ordinance is produced by the staff and presented to the City Council in the form of legislation. If a property owner objects to the recommended controls and incentives agreement, they may file an appeal with the city hearing examiner. Following the hearing proceedings, the examiner may modify the agreement and file their decision with the city clerk. Any parties of record before the examiner may appeal to the City Council. So at the end of the presentation on these slides, you see Susie's sketches of a few examples of landmarks that started, the application process started through members of the community. And there have been an increased number of community initiated landmark applications in the past few years. So we wanted to expand on the images that we're providing today. So we have examples in South Park, in Beacon Hill, Wallingford, Fremont, Licton Springs, on the Duwamish on the Georgetown side across from South Park, in Capitol Hill. Another example in Capitol Hill, the University District, 2 Admiral Junction properties in West Seattle, and 1 in Eastlake. So as Taylor said, Sarah Sote, the City Historic Preservation Officer, is also a working program coordinator for the Landmarks Board. And so we wanted to indicate that we have different geographic areas of the city, and it shows how that breaks down, has Sarah's areas, and then the rest is me. So if there are specific questions for landmarks in those neighborhoods, you'll know who to contact. And if you have a general question, you can always reach out to me directly. I also wanted to acknowledge our 5 colleagues that coordinate historic districts and other regulatory review processes and the administrative needs necessary to operate the full historic preservation program. Those are our colleagues Min Chow, Rebecca, Gina, Mike, and Melinda. We are assisted by additional colleagues in the Department of Neighborhoods related to media requests, outreach and noticing, storytelling, accounting, legislation review, public disclosure requests, and much, much more. Lastly, we have several dozen citizens who collectively volunteer thousands of hours each year serving on the committees, boards, and commissions in the Historic Preservation Program. And this work could never happen without their participation, and we want to sincerely thank them for their service. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erin. That was amazing and very informative. And everyone watching, at the conclusion of the program, I'll send a follow-up so that you all have the link and can follow along. All right, so next up in our program, we have Jeff Murdock. Jeff, while you get your PowerPoint together, I'll go ahead and just share your bio with everyone. So Jeff is the Preservation Advocacy Manager at Historic Seattle. He served on the, served on the Landmarks Preservation Board from 2011 to 2017, witnessing an environment in which saving historic places changed from being challenged by the deepest economic recession to the most heated real estate market in recent history. Jeff holds a Master of Architecture and Master of Science in Architectural History and Theory, both degrees from the University of Washington. Jeff currently serves as the president of the board of directors of the Washington Trust for Historic Preservation, the statewide preservation advocacy organization, which is our neighbor in First Hill. So everyone, please join me in welcoming my colleague, Jeff Murdock.
Thank you, Taylor. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. We get a lot of requests for information from the community about how to make a landmark nomination. So we thought today it'd be useful to go through the kind of nuts and bolts of writing a landmark nomination to designate a resource in Seattle. Excuse me. The nomination report is the foundation for a lot of the work that we do in historic preservation. As Erin described, it's the basis for a landmark designation. It provides permanent documentation of a resource, and it draws in historic themes associated with it. In Seattle, the text or narrative of the nomination becomes part of the city ordinance after it's designated, so it's an important document. This discussion will focus on the nomination process in the city of Seattle, but the structure of a nomination is really the same or very similar wherever you are. I also want to note that you'll often see mostly consultants or agencies presenting nominations, but any individual can do a nomination. In recent memory, some of the best nomination presentations that I have seen have been from individuals. And having sat on the board for years and probably studying hundreds of nominations, it's always refreshing to see a nomination written from a new perspective, kind of a fresh voice. So the nomination is comprised of three main parts. There's the agency application and usually a short introduction to the resource, then the physical description, and finally the statement of significance. And that's typical for nominations of all different types. We also then include supporting documentation like a bibliography, a list of figures, drawings, and photographs and original drawings at the end. In Seattle, we don't embed the images or photographs in the text. They're included as a separate part of the nomination report. So this is an example of the City of Seattle landmark nomination application. It includes a lot of basic information like the location of the resource, the name, historic and current name, present and historic uses, the architect, landscape designer, engineer, any of the individuals kind of related to the resource, and also the owner and nominator. And as Erin just went through all of the nomination or designation standards, I won't repeat them for you, but always keep them in mind as you're writing the nomination. You won't refer to them directly, you won't mention them in the report, but if you're making the case for designation of a resource, it's really important that the board understands the information you're providing and allows them to make the decision to designate the resource. So beginning with the physical description, it's important to remember that this is a work of technical writing, not creative writing. It's really a pretty dry document, but its purpose is to really describe everything about the resource. It's objective, not editorial. So you're not writing an argument to designate the property. You're really just describing it. There's a lot of information in a nomination, so it's dependent on really good organization. We typically work from the broader scale, the neighborhood level, down to the architectural detail scale. So work from large to small, and it's easier to keep things in, keep track of things that way. So the goal is to have a complete written physical description of the building, photographs and narrative. Its construction, form, features, finishes as they exist during the time the nomination is being done. We will describe changes to the resource over time, but the nomination is really describing the property as it is today. And again, keep in mind the designation standards. I thought we'd use it as a case study today, a project we were involved in a couple of years ago to designate the Roy View Apartments on Capitol Hill. Beginning to look at the description from the neighborhood point of view, using Google Maps is a great resource just to indicate the general location of the resource within a certain part of the city. So on the left, you can see that the Roy View occupies the east or the western side of Capitol Hill near I-5 running north-south. And using Google Maps again on the right, you can get a better sense of the neighborhood. The resource is located, occupies most of the northwest quadrant of the block. And you can see that the site slopes to the west toward the freeway. It's important to include a site plan, and you don't have to use architectural software to draw the site plan. And it's often good to use some graphic conventions to make the landmark appear more clear. In this case, we just sort of blocked in the Roy View using gray, so it's clear on the site. And it's important to remember that not all the board members have architectural backgrounds, so making the drawings clear and understandable to anyone is really important. So for some people, the part of the description that's describing the architecture of the building can be the most daunting part, just because the vocabulary is very specific. If you follow this list of parts of the building to describe, you'll typically be able to cover all the parts that are important. You'll have to do a little research on the architectural style. It's important to include the size of the building, both in stories and feet, the height, the form, the shape of the building, massing, include the shape, the roof form, and the material of the roof. How the building is constructed, is it load-bearing masonry or a frame with masonry veneer? Many buildings in Seattle are one or both of those building types. What is the dominant exterior material? Is there wood siding, brick siding? Is there terracotta or cast stone? Those are very typical types of exterior cladding materials. How is the foundation made? What are the materials? Where is the entry on the building? Location of chimneys. Discuss the trim and details. And windows, what type of window? Is it casement windows, double hung windows? And then the type of material, it could be steel, wood, and whether you think that the windows are original. Also, provide a list of the locations, dates, and describe any alterations or additions over time. That information can be found in permit records usually. And finally, describe each elevation of the building, each wall, the primary elevation, locate the entry, describe the organization of apertures in the building, windows and doors, any important features, and of course, the rear and side elevations as well, even though they're secondary elevations. One resource that we have available to us here in King County, which is amazing, is the Assessor's Real Property Card. It was a photographic survey done during the Depression between 1937 and 1940, and it was part of the federal WPA program. All properties in the county were photographed, and really the photograph itself is the most interesting part, but the card contains a lot of great information as well. It has the type of structure, overall dimensions, construction materials. It shows some of the permit records, the owner, the builder. Other resources are also available. A lot of the historic based maps can tell you what the structure is. Those are available online. The entire map book from 1912 is online. SDCI, the building department, has drawings for various buildings that are important to get a hold of. Other archives in the area, like special collections at University of Washington, also have drawings. And then local history books for the various kind of contexts that you'll be looking at can help describe the features of a building. Jeffrey Oxner's Shaping Seattle Architecture is one, and then McAllister's Field Guide to American Houses is another example. For the Roy view, we thought it was important to convey to the board how intact the architecture of this building was. And so we decided to show elevation from Charles Haynes' original drawing against the current photograph of the building. And you can see, like looking at the windows and the cast stone details, that the building is really intact, and it was easy for the board to sort of get that connection. And it can also help as you work your way through the written description, the narrative, to be able to describe it from these drawings and photographs. It's also important to show the building in its neighborhood context. This is looking north on Bellevue. Another view looking west on East Roy Street. You can see that the site drops down steeply on the side of the building. And here looking south on Bellevue Avenue East, you can see the Belroy Apartments in the left photograph, which is also a Seattle landmark. And finally, showing the rear elevation along the alley. It's not the most, not the sexiest view of the building, of course, but it's important. In this case, the courtyard is above and there are garages along the alley below. It's possible to find a lot of information about the construction of the building in newspaper articles. In this case, there was an article that took up almost a full page of the Seattle Daily Times in 1924, saying that the building was almost finished. And it included a lot of advertisements by contractors and suppliers. And it was through that article that we discovered that the courtyard was planted and designed by Malmo and Company, an early nursery in Seattle that was doing landscape design. So we sort of discovered that. And there was a beautiful rendering by Charles Haynes as well in the newspaper from that time. For the Roy view, the plan was really important because it described kind of the architectural features and also the community features of the building. The Roy view is unusual because it's a courtyard apartment, which is an architectural type, but the courtyard is actually in the rear of the building. So the courtyard itself and all the access to apartments is accessed through the center exterior corridor. And as you exit from that corridor, you're confronted with beautiful views of the garden and the city beyond. So it's an amazing experience in the building. Each of the apartments, as shown in these blue arrows, is accessed from its own stairs. There are no corridors. And we really felt that the building, its architecture really helped convey this sense of community, both in historic times from our research of the people who lived there, and in current times. There's an amazing community of people who love this building even now, really a tight-knit community. So then we also had to show images of the courtyard and try to describe it through photographs. So you can see those here. And study of a lot of Charles Haynes' drawings allowed us to understand that many features were still intact. For example, this drawing of the interior stair looks very much like the photograph of the interior stair. And the board, while they don't often designate interior spaces, they do like to understand them and get a sense of what they're like on the inside as well. This slide shows some of the interior features which were still intact that were described in that newspaper article I showed earlier. And again, the board kind of enjoys understanding the different features and what the building feels like on the inside. So the next part of the nomination is the statement of significance. It's where the stories of the resource are told. We tell all the elements of history that are related to it. We're simply providing a historic context. We're not editorializing. So we're not saying things like, this is a beautiful building. This is like the most beautiful place in the city. It's really about just describing again, this is the building, this is the type of building, this is the architect, this is the builder. All the different types of contexts that are significant to this place have to be told. So this statement of significance is dependent on good organization, again, grounded in sound research and well cited. Everything that you're discussing has to be cited in some way. Again, you work from the broader story, the historic context, the neighborhood context, to the details, the architect, the owner, residents of the building, telling all of those stories. It's really important to get a complete statement. And again, keep in mind the standards as you're working through this. It becomes more and more clear which standards probably are applicable to a building as you get your research done. But always keep those standards in mind because it's important to remember that you'll uncover history that you didn't know about. And so it's important to keep that context in mind so you can sort of make the case in describing this context that it's important to the building. So this is a list of the components of the significance statement. We tried to include everything that you should probably look for, not knowing exactly what you are going to find. As I said, you don't know what you don't know when you begin this research. As the meaning of historic preservation is changing in these times, as it should, it's important to include historic context that you won't find in other earlier nominations. And Erin kind of alluded to this earlier. It's important to include the history of those who lived in our area before white settlers came. Also, despite the significance and contributions of people of color in the history of Seattle, there's a lack of representation of those resources. So keep this in mind and do a thorough job of research. As Erin said, if you haven't done that work, you probably get it returned to you. So really work on getting a deep meaning of history associated to this place. In terms of the statement itself, you work again from the neighborhood to the more specific. You'll need to discuss the original design using the plans, the drawings, the original owner, the ownership, the architectural style. All these are discussions to include in your statement. Original uses, changing uses over time. The apartments typically don't change, they stay residential for the most part, but other buildings like buildings on Auto Row, for example, have often had multiple uses. Give examples of other projects by the same architect, designer, or builder, or engineer. And give examples of other buildings with the same architectural style. Try to convey the progress or the meaning of that style through images. And also show kind of examples of that style in Seattle and in that neighborhood so you can get a sense of the context in Seattle. And again, be inclusive in your research, include all elements of cultural, social history, and heritage. So sources of information, we'll delve more deeply into this next week during our research workshop, but some examples of where to find the information include historic maps. You can find these at libraries. Historic photos, many museums, universities, and the city have sources for finding historic photos online, as well as in person at some archives. Delve into local history books, including Shaping Seattle Architecture, which I've shown here. And increasingly, newspapers are easier to do research and have a lot of really interesting original information. Finally, to find some of the biographical and cultural information, census records are great. Some of the genealogical sites online can help with this. City directories, also in libraries. And just researching periodicals for whatever context you're looking for, especially that are contemporary to the time the building was created. So just going through some of this statement of significance information for the Roy view. This is on the left is an image of a 1912 base map, which is the one that is available online. You can see that in 1912, there was nothing on the site of the Roy view. It was kind of a rare blank site in this part of the city. You can also see running north-south along Bellevue, right here, is a kind of a dotted line, which means that there was a streetcar line running on Bellevue, which is an interesting piece of information for 1912. At that point, we could look for photographs that conveyed some of this history, and you can see we found some images of streetcars on that line, as well as some of the commercial development that arose as a result of there being a streetcar there. Other historic maps, this is the Sanborn Fire Insurance Map from 1905 on the left, again shows that the site is empty. and the neighborhood is just beginning to develop. And in 1951, the same maps show that the Roy View has been built and the neighborhood is much more dense. Just to reiterate the importance of newspaper research, it can yield a lot of unknown information. It can give you information about individuals who live in the building. It can give you information about building permits, budgets, kind of stumbling blocks during the construction. All kinds of different stories can be found in newspapers. So it's really important to do comprehensive research in newspapers. This is an example of finding other examples of works by the designers. On the left is the Wilsonian Apartments up on the Ave in the University District. We discovered that Malmo and Company had also designed the landscape for this courtyard, so we included that information. And in the lower right images, these are other works by Charles Haynes, the architect of the Roy View. And once again, another look at the 1937 photo. You can see how important this image is because this part of the block now is covered with trees, really difficult to see. But in these really clear, beautiful photographs from the 30s, you can see so many details, and you're able to compare those to the current condition and really get a sense for both the details that are in the building and really how intact they are as well. In the end, the Roy View was successfully designated. This is the designation hearing. You can see the big community in the back of the room that were there to advocate for this building. The people who lived in the Roy View were an amazing group of people who were part of this advocacy effort. And so that was important. The board could see why people cared so much about this building, and they sort of made that connection really, really well by having all those people there for this meeting. So it was a successful advocacy effort. If you ever have questions, if you have a place that you think is really important and you want to nominate it, I encourage you to reach out to Historic Seattle. We're happy to help with technical assistance or anything else. And just a reminder that next week we will dive more deeply into research methods and sources to help you sort of get through this process, which can, requires a lot of effort, but it's really an amazing process. So I recommend it. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Jeff. For that, before we start getting into the questions, and I know Eugenia, you're going to pop on and facilitate them. I haven't seen any questions come directly to me, and I'm not seeing any on YouTube, but Eugenia, I will hand that over to you at this point.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jeff. That was a really great detailed overview of the nuts and bolts of preparing nomination. And thank you, Erin Daugherty, for your fantastic presentation on the program and the landmarks process and some of those great examples that you showed of some of our wonderful resources, historic resources that are out there that are landmarked and will be around for many, many more years. So let's see, we have, first off, I want to thank Marvin Anderson for including in the website, the chat, the website for the Puget Sound Regional Archives, where they have those property records and the photographs that Jeff talked about from the WPA era. And it's not just from that era, they continued the photographing and the records through the decades. So it's a really great resource in King County. So thanks, Marvin, for updating that. It's great to see more stuff come online. So let's see, we have a question. One is there any compensation available for a property owner if a property is designated without their desire to do so? Who would like to take that? Erin or Jeff?
There's no direct financial compensation, but if there is a landmark, there are those financial incentives and other types of incentives that are available to the property owners. I don't know if that helps answer the question.
Great, thank you. I know we get a lot of questions from people who would say, are there grants? Are there, such and such? And So For Culture has grants available for landmarks and contributing buildings in historic districts. It's a competitive process. So sometimes there are planning grants for special projects, and other times there's money for capital projects as well. But just by virtue of having a landmark, no one's going to give you money. Let's put it that way. Just to own the landmark. Yeah, and then same thing with property taxes. This sort of a lot of this is spurred on by doing work on the house, investing in the building to renovate it, and then that could get you some incentives. Let's see. Question from Rachel: are there common mistakes that people tend to make when nominating a place? Erin, is that something that you could come to
Trying to
mind?
think of what a common mistake is, maybe leaving out information. Jeff showed a good example of a site plan. Many times that piece of information is left out. I think sometimes people just don't know where to go to look for information. Even when they're trying to do in-depth research, they may not know. And so a lot of the examples Jeff's using are the things that we share with folks as well. Or we might send them directly to a certain collection or organization that might have resources that aren't easily found or aware to most folks. So we try and help bridge that gap. And legal descriptions. I think that could be a mistake. Many times things are just sort of left out, but legal descriptions can be challenging. And so that's something that I'm regularly helping people try and navigate, and had to learn some of that from Sarah directly about what are some ways to figure out a legal description when the county's legal description isn't like a complete, it's like an abbreviated description, or it might just reference a parcel. So what is the type of additional research you can do to come up with the accurate information? And the reason that's important to us is that there are legal descriptions that are incorrect and might be describing a different property, or it might be describing a property that it is incomplete, like it may only describe a portion of the site that you're trying to designate. So it's really important from a legal perspective for us to try and get that done correctly. So we help in any way that we can think of.
Great. Thank you, Erin. And I know sometimes I mean, the nominations that we've seen are pretty beefy and they're really good reports, but they're also not meant to be the exhaustive end all, document of a place, because you could spend a lot of time. You could almost write a whole book about each place, but that's sort of not the purpose of the nomination itself. It needs to be comprehensive and detailed, definitely, and most of all, accurate and objective. So that's the key thing. And if you're out there and you're reading nominations and you're not directly involved and you see information that's missing or maybe incorrect, definitely submit comments to Erin or Sarah and the board, because they would like to know that, just to make sure that, because it's in the public record, so the most accurate information is best. Let's see. So the next question is, so the reason for the first question about compensation for the property owner is that some of the bundle of rights from a property may have been removed by the process. I'm not sure if it's talking about property rights, or maybe there's perhaps a misinterpretation. I think maybe understanding what landmark designation does to a property. Maybe Erin or Sarah, you can probably respond to this.
There's also the appeals process that I mentioned, which is also available to a property owner. So that's an opportunity as well.
Okay.
So when someone says, what are those other options? there are options, as I described, as part of the negotiation of the controls and incentives agreement.
Let's see. Next question from Stephanie. If a potential nomination needs some minor structural work, would restoration work prior to the nomination or as nomination moves forward be a good thing?
Do you want me to speak to that, or?
Whoever is best.
There's different perspectives. I mean, it's not required that anyone restore a building before it's proposed to become a landmark. But obviously, if something has had some restoration, especially if there's been a lot of deferred maintenance, it's helpful because it helps demonstrate the property has physical integrity. But it wouldn't necessarily prevent the board from considering it. But it can help if integrity is a question that the board may struggle with. So, and I'm happy if someone has a particular property in mind and they want to talk about those things before they start their nomination, I'm happy to weigh in on that, as would Sarah be as well.
I would
That's great.
add that, oh, sorry.
Oh, I just want to mention that there's a difference between condition and integrity. The condition of the building, just because something might not be in the best condition, should not prevent someone from wanting to bring that forth to the landmarks board, because a building can have, fair or poor condition, but still retain many of its character defining features that help convey the building's significance. Jeff, you want to say something?
Oh, just also depending on the level of structural work you're talking about, it may make sense to try to integrate that into, your plans for designation and take advantage of special tax valuation, for example. So there's certain timelines that you have to follow. So keeping that in mind, it may be helpful to coordinate both the structural project and the designation together.
Thank you.
And that could also be another good reason to call us and talk to us about what your plans may be and what your timelines may be for your application versus your projects. And we can offer some guidance there as well.
Great. Next question from Kai. How does Seattle Landmarks Ordinance compare or contrast with other ordinances found across the country? That's a big question.
I don't have enough knowledge of other ordinances to speak to comparison. I don't know if Sarah has an opportunity to answer that if she's still on, but yeah.
Yeah, and this is Sarah, and I also don't have enough knowledge to really provide a strong compare and contrast. I do know that the Seattle's ordinance was based on New York City's ordinance, and although it has evolved since then, our ordinance here in Seattle is pretty consistent with a lot of other cities' landmark ordinances across the country.
Yeah, I've seen other ordinances. I've worked in other places. It's a strong ordinance, definitely. And I think the fact that owner consent is not required, except for religious owned properties, that sets it apart in Washington State. I think Tacoma is similar in King County, but how it's compared to others around the country, it's unclear. But the owner consent piece, I think, is important. Okay, let's see. Another question from Rachel. She says thank you. And also, how many hours does a typical nomination report take to create? Jeff, maybe you want to take this one.
Well, it is a time-consuming task, no doubt. And the research requires a lot of time. Having done nominations during COVID, I have to say that there's limitations to not being able to go to collections, archives, and libraries yourself. But having to do one without having access to those places, it certainly took a lot less time. But it is a time-consuming project. The photography, the the research takes the most time, and then the writing is also time consuming. So it's hard for me to give you a ballpark, and it certainly depends on the resource as well. But yeah, it's a big project.
Yeah, and with research, those of us who love research, you could always go down the rabbit hole. There's always something more to research, so because it's the fun part. And then the writing, some people you get writer's block when you're doing one of these things, and that could kind of hold you up, or you could write a lot of pages of words all at once. It just really depends. And then also the other part of it is putting the whole thing together, packaging it so that all the graphics, the labeling, the images, that all takes time. So it takes more time than you might think. So just allow yourself enough time. There are not a lot of the nominations are prepared by consultants, so they do this a lot, and so they can offer an estimate of what it would cost to do something like this. Let's see. Stephanie says, "Thank you. I'll call you, Erin." And so definitely some kudos here. And so, are there any other questions? And as you know, Erin and Sarah, they provided their information, contact information. You can always contact them with questions, or contact me or Jeff. I know many of you on this at this meeting, you follow the process very closely, or you prepared your own nominations as well. So thank you for coming. I think if there are no more questions, I'll turn it back over to you, Taylor.
Okay, thank you all. This is really wonderful. I'm not seeing any questions on YouTube, so it looks like we're going to end our time together a little early. The last kind of note that I want to end on is I'll share my screen again. Jeff referenced next week's workshop session. So I'll just put this up so that you all can see that. Researching historic properties for landmark nominations, same place, same time. If you haven't already registered for that, there's still time to do so. It will be on YouTube like the rest of the series if you're not able to join us live. If you want to make sure that I email you the link to that, go ahead and register, even if you can't join us live. It's no problem at all. But yeah, I think that is everything. I really appreciate you all for being with us and sharing all of this very useful information. And we'll see you next week. Most of you next week, I assume. All right. Thanks all.
Thank you.